Tonight marks a rupture in American political history, a moment future historians will return to again and again, not because of a single vote or a single ruling, but because something far more rare has occurred. For the first time in nearly a decade, Donald Trump is standing alone, not rhetorically isolated, not temporarily embarrassed, but structurally abandoned. The machinery that once shielded him is grinding to a halt, and everyone in Washington can feel it. For 9 years, we watched the Republican Party bend itself into shapes it never imagined possible. Norms were dismissed, institutions were weakened, behavior once considered disqualifying was reframed as strategy. Not because they didn't see the danger, but because fear and ambition told them that loyalty to Trump was the only path to relevance and power. They told themselves they could manage him, control him, ride the chaos, and step off before it consumed them. But power built on fear never lasts forever. And tonight, the wind has shifted. Look at what's missing right now. The rapid response defenses, the coordinated talking points, the chorus of loyal surrogates flooding cable news. Instead, there is silence. A heavy, unmistakable silence that signals something has broken behind closed doors. Allies who once rushed to the cameras are suddenly unavailable. Defenders who once mocked every warning are now saying, "Let the process play out." In Washington, that phrase has a meaning. It means distance, it means retreat, it means survival instincts have replaced loyalty. Trump has not lost power yet, but he has lost something he depended on even more: the belief inside his own party that standing beside him is still safe. What changed everything wasn't a leak, a rumor, or a partisan attack. It was a court record, dry, procedural, unemotional, the kind of document Washington usually skims past without consequence. But once those materials were unsealed, the reaction inside Republican leadership rooms was immediate and visceral. This wasn't just another legal headache. It was a betrayal laid out in black and white. At first glance, the ruling appeared to focus on familiar territory: contempt of court, abuses of authority, violations tied to immigration enforcement. Serious, yes, but nothing this party hadn't already rationalized away before. For years, those issues were framed as policy disputes, unfortunate excesses, or necessary toughness. That's how they survived politically, that's how they slept at night. But buried inside the unsealed material was something far more destabilizing. Evidence not merely of wrongdoing, but of intent. Evidence that the machinery of power wasn't just being aimed outward at political opponents or marginalized communities, but inward, toward members of Trump's own coalition. The documents didn't just describe lawbreaking, they described a mindset, a worldview where loyalty was provisional and hesitation was suspicious. That is what triggered panic, because once it became clear that the inner workings of the administration included tracking, documenting, and evaluating allies themselves, the illusion shattered. This was no longer about defending a president against external threats. It was about self-preservation. Senators and operatives began to recognize themselves not as partners in power, but as variables in a system designed to punish deviation. That realization spreads fast, faster than any press release can contain, faster than any spin operation can neutralize, and once it takes hold, loyalty doesn't erode slowly. It collapses all at once. What emerged next from the unsealed records was the moment the room truly went quiet, not because of outrage, but because of recognition. The documents revealed the existence of a covert surveillance roster, one that went far beyond activists, journalists, or political adversaries. The system had names, familiar names, Republican names. For years, lawmakers had convinced themselves that surveillance was something that happened to the other side. Protesters, reporters, immigrants, dissidents. That belief was the glue holding the coalition together. As long as power flowed in one direction, loyalty felt rational, but the records told a different story. They showed an administration quietly assembling files on its own allies, using data-driven tools to assess who was obedient, who hesitated, and who might someday step out of line. This is how conspiracies survive. Everyone inside believes they are protected. They assume proximity equals safety. But the instant people realize they are being monitored rather than trusted, the structure collapses. That moment arrived the second senators saw evidence that hesitation itself had become a liability. And suddenly, the behavior across Washington made sense. Phones stopped being answered. Chiefs of staff stopped returning calls. Familiar defenders vanished from television panels they once dominated. Staffers began whispering to reporters, not in outrage, but in fear. Because fear changes incentives faster than ideology ever could. The lesson was unmistakable. This surveillance apparatus was never meant solely for the radical left. It was designed for anyone who paused, anyone who questioned, anyone who imagined that an independent legislature could coexist with unchecked executive power. Under that model, there are no allies, only subordinates. And once Republican lawmakers understood that the same tools used to intimidate opponents were now pointed at them, loyalty became irrational, not immoral, dangerous. In that moment, the party didn't just lose confidence in the president, it lost the illusion that standing beside him offered protection. This is where Project 2025 stops being an abstract blueprint and reveals itself as a governing philosophy. Strip away the policy language, and what remains is a single, uncompromising idea. Power must flow in one direction, and anything that slows it down is a threat. Under this model, the presidency is not a coordinate branch of government. It is the command center. Everyone else exists downstream. The theory of a unitary executive sounds technical, even academic, when debated in law reviews. But in practice, it produces a brutally simple reality. There is no independent Congress, there is no co-equal branch, there are no partners in governance, there is only loyalty, compliance, and usefulness. The moment someone hesitates, asks questions, or asserts institutional independence, they cease to be an ally and become a problem to be managed. That is what Republican lawmakers are now confronting. They didn't misread the situation because they were naive. They misread it because they assumed power always rewards loyalty. What the unsealed evidence made unmistakably clear is that loyalty was never enough. It merely delayed scrutiny. The system wasn't built to protect allies forever. It was built to rank them. Once that realization set in, the panic became rational. Because if the executive branch views Congress as a subordinate obstacle rather than a partner, then every safeguard collapses. Oversight becomes insubordination. Budget authority becomes sabotage. Dissent becomes disloyalty. And that is the trap. A structure designed to neutralize enemies eventually consumes those who thought they were exempt. The same logic that justified extraordinary powers against outsiders now justifies their use against insiders. Under a unitary executive, there is no safe distance from the center of power. There is only proximity, and proximity cuts both ways. For years, some of the most powerful figures in finance and technology made a calculated wager. They didn't need to like Donald Trump, they just needed to manage him. Tax cuts, deregulation, market access, those were the returns they believed justified the volatility. The chaos was a feature, not a bug, as long as it stayed political and didn't spill into balance sheets. The unsealed court material changed that calculation overnight. What alarmed the donor class wasn't ideology or rhetoric, it was capability. The documents made clear that the administration had explored executive mechanisms to place independent financial institutions under direct presidential influence and to weaponize financial infrastructure against perceived adversaries. That is the line capital will not cross. Markets can absorb scandal, they can absorb instability. What they cannot function under is discretionary punishment. If a president can reach into the Treasury, freeze assets, restrict access to banking systems, or threaten corporate survival based on loyalty tests, then contracts stop mattering. Risk becomes unknowable. Capital flees not out of moral outrage, but out of self-preservation. Quietly, phones stopped ringing. Executives who once defended Trump's unpredictability as strength went silent. Political donations slowed, then froze. The same tech leaders who once spoke confidently about disruption began looking for exits. Because disruption is exciting right up until it threatens your own company, your own shareholders, your own freedom to operate. This wasn't a moral awakening, it was a market signal. A collective recognition that the infrastructure they helped finance, the data pipelines, the algorithms, the surveillance tools, was no longer contained. It was now aimed at the system that made their wealth possible. And when capital withdraws, it does so decisively. No speeches, no statements, just absence. That absence is now part of Trump's isolation, not because elites suddenly grew a conscience, but because the risk finally became real. Isolation should never be mistaken for surrender. In fact, history teaches the opposite lesson. An authoritarian leader is most dangerous not at the height of power, but at the moment that power begins to slip. That is where the country finds itself now. Donald Trump is boxed in, but he is far from disarmed, and that is why the next 72 hours matter. The signals are unmistakable. Congressional loyalty is fracturing, donors are pulling back, courts are closing ranks. The informal guardrails that once absorbed his excesses are no longer holding. For a leader who equates personal survival with national destiny, that combination creates a singular incentive. Act before control is lost entirely. And the tools at his disposal are still formidable. He retains command authority. He still exerts influence over segments of federal law enforcement willing to comply. Most critically, the unsealed material confirms that contingency plans were not hypothetical exercises. They were drafted, refined, and prepared for precisely this moment, when political backing collapses and legal pressure converges. This is why the timeline is so dangerous. A leader who believes he has nothing left to lose does not wait for outcomes. He preempts them. He governs by decree, daring institutions to stop him. He reframes resistance as rebellion and casts himself as the last line of order against manufactured chaos. The temptation now is escalation. Invoke emergency powers, test the limits of the Insurrection Act, bypass Congress under the justification of national security, force the courts into an open confrontation. These moves are not signs of confidence. They are the reflexes of a cornered system trying to reassert dominance through speed and shock. Trump may be isolated, but isolation sharpens desperation, and desperation compresses decision-making. That is why this window is uniquely volatile. The restraints that once slowed him are weakening, while the incentives to act unilaterally are peaking. When power feels temporary, it is used recklessly and often without regard for what comes next. This is the moment where quiet concern is no longer enough. Private frustration is no longer enough. Anonymous quotes to reporters are no longer enough. History does not record what lawmakers whispered behind closed doors. It records what they did when the Constitution was tested. Right now, Congress still holds real power, but it is a narrowing window. The authority to fund or defund, the power to subpoena, the ability to compel testimony in public view. These are not symbolic tools. They are constitutional weapons designed for precisely this kind of crisis, when executive power threatens to slip beyond lawful control. Most importantly, there is impeachment, not as a partisan reflex, not as a political talking point, but as a stabilizing mechanism, a signal that no president, regardless of party, is above the law. Waiting for the storm to pass is not neutrality. It is abdication, and history is unforgiving to institutions that confuse caution with responsibility. What makes this moment different is that party labels have lost their protective value. The unsealed material made that unmistakable. The surveillance, the leverage, the coercive architecture, it was never confined to political enemies. It was built for anyone who stood in the way. That includes the lawmakers now hesitating. If Congress fails to act while the president is isolated and exposed, it risks losing the ability to act at all. Executive power, once consolidated, does not volunteer to shrink. Oversight delayed becomes oversight denied. Accountability postponed becomes accountability impossible. This is not about removing a man. It is about preserving a system. The Constitution does not enforce itself. It relies on people willing to use it. The question facing Congress now is simple and brutal. Will it exercise its authority while it still can? Or will it look back and realize the moment passed while it was waiting for someone else to move first? Donald Trump may be alone tonight, but the danger does not disappear with his isolation. In some ways, it grows because what we are witnessing is not just the collapse of a presidency, but the unraveling of a system built around a single man. Cultures of power do not dissolve quietly, they fracture, and when they do, they threaten to take institutions down with them. The illusion has finally shattered. The belief that safeguards were unbreakable, that norms would hold, that extraordinary power could be handed to one individual without consequence. The architects of this machinery are now stepping back, not out of courage, but out of fear. And that should tell every American something important. The warnings were not exaggerations, they were early alarms. But this moment cannot end with recognition alone. Identifying the illness is not the same as curing it. The structures that enabled abuse do not shut themselves off when one figure is weakened. Surveillance systems do not dismantle themselves. Emergency powers do not quietly return to the shelf. If left intact, they will be used again by someone else or by the same person in a different form. This is why the stakes go beyond Donald Trump. What matters now is whether institutions reassert themselves, whether laws are enforced, and whether accountability is real. That requires judges willing to stand firm, lawmakers willing to act, whistleblowers willing to speak, and citizens willing to pay attention, even when the headlines fade. Trump stands alone because he demanded loyalty to himself above all else. America must stand together because our loyalty is to something larger, the rule of law, constitutional limits, and the idea that no one ever is above them. The truth is no longer hidden. What comes next will define what remains standing when this moment passes.